idea of history and the practice of architecture. Thank you for inviting me to deliver the keynote address in the session themed on the application of urban conservation, history and its criticism in architecture, design, planning and innovation within the larger issue of enhancing the connections in multidisciplinary aspects of design. Keeping in mind the etymology of keynote as the basic tone or note of a musical scale or composition, I'd like to start my keynote address today with a short piece of music.
सिकंदर ने पोरस से की थी लड़ाई, जो की थी लड़ाई तो मैं क्या करूं, जो कौरव ने पांडव से की हाथापाई, जो की हाथापाई तो मैं क्या करूं, सिकंदर ने पोरस से की थी लड़ाई, जो की थी लड़ाई तो मैं क्या करूं.
This refrain of a popular song from the Hindi film Anpar, released about 3 generations ago, captures the essence of our theme today. Alluding to well-known figures from Indian history, the question that a bunch of carefree children ask, how does the battle between Sikandar and Porus or between the Kauravas and Pandavas concern them, underlines the fact that most people consider history to be irrelevant and unconnected with their lives. It is precisely because it is not usual to integrate history with mainstream living and planning that we are obliged to have a conference that looks at ways to do so. Most interpretations of history contain the assumption that it is separate from the present and that it needs to be represented along a concept of linearly progressive time by a select band of professionals. E.H. Carr, in his book, What is History, published in 1961, quoting Professor George Clarke from the New Cambridge Modern History of 1957, is unequivocal about, and I quote, the doctrine that since all historical judgments involve persons and points of view, one is as good as another, and there is no objective historical truth, unquote. Despite recognizing that there is no objective historical truth, Carr still limits history to the domain of the professional historian. As the architect and educator N.J. Habrakan observes, we have been educated in a culture of science, technology, and organization that is overwhelmingly professional. This culture is, if not ignorant, deeply suspicious of the productive power of the lay world and its variety of social patterns. End of quote. Why is this so? And why is it that professionals, even those in the field of design, architecture, or governance, consider history incidental, even inimical to creativity and innovation? The foremost reason is that in the modernist tradition, which we have been educated in, the separation of professionals from the rest of society is a given, as is the sidelining of history from architectural practice. This is seen in the compartmentalized way that architectural history is taught, delinked from actual construction or the function of the building. Even within itself as a discipline, architectural history is isolated into periods or styles. For instance, the history of Indian architecture continues to be taught in the same mode as that set forth by the art historian Percy Brown, who headed the Lahore School of Art and authored the books Indian Architecture Volume 1, Buddhist and Hindu Periods, and Volume 2, Islamic Period. As evident in the titles, this method divides architecture into periods based on religion or dynasties. This division is characteristic of the institutional method of teaching history in general. As Jadunath Sarkar in the Sir William Mayer Lectures, delivered at the Madras University in March 1928, notes, we usually study the history of India as divided into watertight compartments or periods. One great effect of this method of treatment is that we thereby lose sight of the life of the nation as a whole. End of quote. To find an alternative to such an admittedly incomplete method, it seems logical to investigate if there was always a separation between the practice of architecture and history and between professionals and lay people. When we survey the field further back in time, we observe that before the onset of industrialization and colonialism, history and knowledge in general was not limited exclusively to the written form or to a unidimensional interpretation or to just professionals, but was connected to a societal worldview. Acts deemed important in shaping collective identity, as well as useful innovations and best technical practices, were treasured. They were retained in public memory and transmitted through multiple forms that had immediacy and intimacy: customs, music, epic poems, etc. This is especially so in the Indian context, where the objectives of knowledge are tied to dharma, which is a concept of a united, ethical, and ecological balance. To generate answers about the relationship between architecture and history in our particular context, and enhance connections between the now separate disciplines of conservation and mainstream architecture, I believe we first need to understand the Indian worldview. I have written about this at length in other places. Here, I will merely point out that to perceive the Indian worldview as a prelude to understanding its relationship with history and architecture, we need to explore the concept of Lakshan, central to this worldview. Lakshan or Lakshanam means distinguishing attributes that are used to perceive or understand a thing or event or person, even through different instants of time. Despite the opinion of some scholars that an essential cultural identity does not exist anywhere in the world, we can identify the Lakshan of the Indian worldview from ancient times. The essence of this worldview, articulated in intellectual terms of a very high order, in sacred compilations such as the Upanishads, is constituted of a belief in a unity within myriad manifestations and apparent change, which connects us to a vast and cyclical nature of time, Kal, and space, Akash, through multiple births. In design, these connections are seen both in theory and practice in the term Shilpa, which is associated with the creative process of making as much as with the end product. Shilpa includes all the arts: dance, theater, music, ritual practices, and especially architecture, as a setting as well as a repository for all life. Innovation and multidisciplinary connections are thus an essential part of the Indic worldview and its knowledge systems. Planning, product design, conservation, sculpture, etc., which are now studied under separate heads, were all dealt with together in traditional Indian Shilpa Shastras. It would seem then that in our search for enhancing the connections in multidisciplinary aspects of design, we can gain much from re-looking at the principles of Shilpa. As we are well aware, these principles and the worldview that gave rise to them were forcibly changed with the colonization of India. This becomes apparent when we see the Rashtrapati Bhavan built as a viceregal palace representing the height of British imperial power. Here, the formulation of space, as well as the predominant attributes expressed in it, the proportion of built versus open space, or the sizes and volume of its labyrinthine sequence of giant rooms that stand aloof from the outside, adhere to ideas of beauty based on European classical ideals. Our current fixation for extra-large, centralized projects in cities and buildings, as well as the negation and isolation of older architecture in our ideas of development today, may be said to be a direct outcome of our colonial inheritance. Instead of a colonial borrowed framework limited to a study of architectural styles, I have come to use in my research and practice a methodology of Lakshan Parichay that seeks to understand architecture, historical or otherwise, through a search for its lakshan or distinguishing attributes. Rather than talk in abstract terms, let me share briefly how such a methodology may be applied to the primary resource of a well-known piece of architecture, the Red Fort of Delhi. Built as the imperial center of Shahjahanabad, the fort is a large and many-layered complex that is transformed greatly, primarily because of deliberate destruction of more than 3/4 of it by the British after 1857. On surveying the Red Fort, the following lakshans may be observed. 1. Flexibility and versatility, evident in the very choice of building elements in the fort, the pavilion, the hall, the veranda, the courtyard, which respond to seasonal variations and varying functions and transform easily with the provision of awnings and curtains to extend the actual use as well as the sense of space. 2. Multiple levels of use, seen in the multitude of functions grouped together in proximity. Formal entrance streets, halls of justice, workshops, kitchen gardens, elephant and horse stables, resident quarters for soldiers, attendants, etc. Meant for multiple purposes and also for multiple users. These accommodate participation of different groups of people. Third, optimization, seen in the huge number of activities housed within the built structures and open areas of the fort, formulated to be both decorative and functional. So, buildings within and around gardens and forecourts enhance geometry and give shade, while open spaces yield large community areas, verdure, fruit, vegetables, and herbs. Fourth, respect for the context, seen in the fort's positioning and spatial configuration as a response to the Yamuna River and the disposition of the Aravalis, as well as older architectural and geological components of Delhi, such as the Salimgarh Fort, Baulis, hillocks, and water systems. None of these were razed to the ground or hidden, but incorporated into the layout of the fort and city. Fifth, improvisation, seen in the sizes, motifs, or details of courtyards and pavilions, which follow an adaptable system of construction, proportions, and composition, rather than being exact replicas of each other or adhering to rigid grid modules. Sixth, decentralization, seen in the manner in which multiple master builders and guild heads from all parts of the imperial domains led teams of calligraphers, garden designers, carpenters, dome builders, finial makers, masons, stone cutters, sculptors, inlayers, etc., to work together in consultation with the patron, as well as other technicians and officials, to create beautiful spaces. So what is the purpose of history in education? The African writer Chimamanda Adichie points out in a lecture that explores the limitations of depictions of just one view about cultures and people, that, and I quote, the single story creates stereotypes. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult, unquote. Defining history merely as a study of the past and looking at it from borrowed concepts of time and space is such a stereotype that robs people of the validity of seeing themselves from their own standpoints. To rid ourselves of such stereotypes, we will need to arrive at alternative, pertinent ways of looking at architecture and history, and indeed at knowledge systems. This implies a rethinking at many levels. The methodology of Lakshan Parichay is one such way of rethinking our approach to history. As we have seen, it helps us to discover how conservation, in terms of the principles of optimization of built and natural resources and human skills and collaborative building methods, can direct the design and building and use of even such a large and grand new project as the Imperial Red Fort, and how this is but a continuation and innovation of the indigenous Indian worldview. These principles can help us in four broad ways. One, in guiding us in contemporary design practice to devise new buildings and urbanscapes in a world witnessing climate change. In innovating appropriate conservation responses to historic architecture. In experientially integrating time and space in current and earlier built efforts, instead of isolating these into time warps, and in connecting different design domains. So far, I've been talking about what we should do. Let me end with a couple of examples of what we should not do. At present, the Red Fort's environs are conventional water-guzzling lawns, bounded with fences to keep out people. A superficial and irresponsible interpretation of the green spaces depicted in archival maps. This completely reverses the original lakshanas of the ecologically appropriate orchards designed as inclusive spaces for inhabitants of Shahjahanabad to walk in and gather for celebrations. Instead, appropriate conservation could create a people and climate-friendly space that innovatively responds to current severe constraints of water scarcity. The second example is a Chatta Bazaar, designed as a fort's principal entrance way for dignitaries, which functioned as a work and display space for the best craftspeople of the empire. This was designed as a flexible interplay between arcaded cells, an octagonal courtyard, and walled gardens to allow multiple activities. The proposal published in the national newspaper to restore it into a conjectural Victorian market disconnects the bazaar's arcades behind wood and glass panel doors, interrupts their flow of space, and becomes a travesty of its original attributes. As responsible professionals, we should not be party to such travesties, but instead embrace the very principle of conservation in every aspect of our work. This will develop a unity in visualizing and living so that history, design, planning, and innovation are neither separate nor irrelevant to anyone's life, and so that they re-establish human interest, re-establish local and larger contexts, and re-establish connections with time and space. I hope the presentations today will help us to do so. Thank you.